as an evaluator, it's been about more than a couple of decades. I think far too often we treat evaluations, we do evaluations because they have to be done, not because anybody wants it to be done. That's one. Point number two, even in cases where where somebody wants it to be done, it's not really clear what learning actually means. This equation of we are trying to do an evaluation, the evaluation will lead to learning, seems increasingly superficial to me. So we talk about accountability, and we're into accountability, and that stuff is learning. I think part of where I'm going to be stressing today is what does accountability towards learning actually mean? The bad news is, as has been my style in the last 6 months, I'm trying to do too much. It's going to be a fairly packed set of ideas. For the first 10 minutes, I'm going to get you to think about your intervention. Think about, well, what makes it complex, if at all. That's 10 minutes. 2 is I'm going to introduce developmental evaluation rather quickly, rather superficially. So that's 10 minutes is the maximum I have for that. That's 20. 2 examples. I'm going to truly breeze through it. I could spend 2 hours on each one of them. That's 3. 4th is accountability to learning. So basically 10, 10, 10, and 10 is our theory of change, and that sort of leaves us time for questions. Ron will cut me off around 11:45 or so. So let's start basics. What's evaluation? And all of you do it in some form or the other. And again, by the way, if you had more time, I'd be asking you what you do. But this is from the Treasury Board of Canada. I work with them. By the way, this is actually important. The Center for Excellence in Evaluation actually has a lot of appetite for developmental evaluation. This is the Treasury Board of Canada. Evaluation is defined both as a means of assessing performance and to identify alternative ways to deliver. I call this a good enough definition. I'm going to say it's incomplete, and it'll become clear in a minute. The second bullet repeats the same idea. But what I want you to start thinking about is your own intervention, whether it's worker safety, whether it's health. The question I want to ask you is, how sure are you at the start of an intervention of how the current is going to flow through your intervention? Actually, are you sure that your knowledge base is that complete to actually implement an intervention? I grew up doing a whole range of experimental trials, etc. I go to communities in Scotland in 2005 when I started. I would go along and say, well, actually, the evidence base is pretty strong for this. And once I actually began encountering the problems of implementation, I had to sort of back off and say, actually, our evidence base can go this far, maybe 5% of the way. The other 80% still needs to be uncovered in specific contexts. But the question I want you to think about today is, in a world of incomplete knowledge, in a world where our understanding of specific contexts, specific communities are incomplete, what role can evaluation, what role can evaluative thinking play in navigating interventions? When I was in the US, we did a very large evaluation that started off as a $30–35 million evaluation that became a $50 million evaluation. The paradox was, on day one, we knew there was a problem. 5 years into the evaluation, after tons of data, we knew there was a problem. The question, and you'll see a much more dramatic version of this question coming back in a minute or so, what's the role that evaluation can play in navigating interventions? Not so much write this grand report at the end of the study. When you sort of see, actually, these are dynamic processes. What kinds of information can we provide? So, this is evaluation theorists, some of them my friend, talking about, well, why do we do evaluations? One argument is assess the merit and worth of programs. We run RCTs, we do qualitative studies, say, is this a worthwhile investment? We spend a lot of time saying, well, actually, this has been implemented. Can we improve things? Okay, I'll come back to this theme in a few minutes from now. When I was in Scotland, the Scottish smoking ban was implemented. One of the questions we asked was in the bars, are people complying with the law? Okay, that's more of an audit function. I think I want you to pay attention to the 4th bullet, and the 5th one is coming. And this was a bit of a surprise to me, because when I started doing my evaluations 20 years ago, right out of fresh out of graduate school, I thought, well, okay, geez, people know what they're doing, let them implement what they're doing. Our job is to go study whether the programs are working. And the surprise for me as I went to the communities was actually people struggled with actual implementation, and evaluations themselves provided an opportunity to learn about what you should have known on day one. Okay? And now what do you think about that? This is welcome to Paisley, Scotland. This is where some of these ideas were born. And this actual rather dramatic example is where I thought I really felt convinced that I had to change my stripes, if you will. So I was doing some version of a pretty traditional study. This was a national demonstration project in Scotland. The Scottish government were very keen to see, by implementing huge problems of health inequality in Scotland, as you have in Canada. The focus was by focusing on, the hope was by focusing on the poorest areas in Scotland, and Paisley being one of them. The hope was they would reach the poorest individual. Remember, an important take-home lesson from today is we make assumptions all the time. I've just made a pretty massive assumption. By focusing on poor areas, I'm going to get poor people. That may not be true. So, £10 million are spent in a huge amount of reach activities. A massive program of work is planned around screening, health coaching, etc., etc. Their hope is, by getting the poorest people, over time, as a series of miracles happen, this would lead towards a reduction in health inequalities. Now, if I had more time, I'd go deeper into it. But the big question here is, 3 months into the intervention, the project director sitting in Paisley uncovers, and this is not a surprise for you, that most of the people coming through the doors are not the poorest, are not the most disadvantaged. This is a story you've heard many times before. But here's the difference. She calls me. I'm sitting in a posh office in Edinburgh, Scotland. It's a fantastic place to be. He says, we've got a problem. All our investments in reach are not quite working out. People who are coming through our doors are not the poorest. The question she's posing, she says, should we continue as planned and let this experiment unfold for the next 2 to 3 years? Or should we double up our reach efforts? I want you to pay attention to this, because if you get the richest or the better off in the community, if all of the stuff in the middle works, you've got the exact opposite problem. You actually, as a series of providing goodies, you might actually exacerbate community inequities in those communities. So this idea that who comes through your door matters. And here's the important part. I'm running a very traditional evaluation. And the correct thing to do was a great question. Let's have a meeting with the Scottish government. I'm empowered to do that. What did I say? I said, no, this is a traditional evaluation. You've got to let the experiment unfold as is. And I thought, looking back, it's pretty embarrassing. That's not the way we ought to be doing things. She was being actually incredibly diligent to say, we need navigational help, not necessarily from the evaluator, maybe from the Scottish government. To say, actually, should we spend some of our resources to double up our reach activities? It's a completely fair question. And any given day, we're always making those kinds of navigational choices. But I want you to sort of, for this example, stress the need for a more developmental approach. Okay, with me? So, and this is why we set up the Evaluation Center for Complex Health Interventions. I think I've learned the hard way. This is not the exception. This story is the norm. If you empower people to ask questions, that's the kind of question they will be asking. So the question we're asking in the Evaluation Center is, can we move towards an integrated knowledge translation evaluation strategy, where thinking evaluatively, that's what she was doing. She was actually saying, if all these people come through our doors, chances are we're going to have a problem with our people. So the question we're asking is, can thinking evaluatively enhance the likelihood that a program policy has impact on key outcomes over time? Well, I think part of the idea here is evaluation not right towards the end. Evaluation, evaluative thinking as we go along, as a knowledge translation activity itself. Okay. And that is, in that idea lies the seeds of developmental evaluation. We'll come back to it in about 3 minutes. So I want you to focus on your own intervention. I just demonstrated to you that addressing health inequalities, and I didn't have time, but there were a series of theoretical assumptions, and there's no escaping it. My big assumption was, let's focus on poor areas. There's a lot of other deeper assumptions out there that I don't have time to go into. All of you made assumptions. Just come spend an hour today. Say, well, actually, going here for an hour might or might not help me in my work down the road. We are always making those kinds of assumptions. Every one of our programs is based on such assumptions. Furthermore, it involves the actions of people, It consists of a chain of steps. It's not as simple as take a drug, you're going to feel better. No, it's action 1 leads to action 2, leads to action 3. A baton needs to get passed on. Pay attention to the last two. Interventions are prone to modifications as they're implemented. Interventions are open systems and change through learning as stakeholders come to understand them. This is important because in the way we think about evaluation, we think of our interventions as static entities. We actually don't build in the fact that they actually have to change. That's what learning actually means. Okay. I'll come back to these ideas. So, what I want you to think about is your own favorite intervention, one that's consuming your life right now. Questions for reflection. If you went home and explained this intervention to your friend or a spouse, I try to do this with my mother, and I call up my mother. How hard is it to describe? Can you do it especially if you're paying $2.50, and sometime back when I recall India, say that you Skype, you have to try to find economical ways of describing it. How hard is it to create? We just don't pay attention. We sort of draw a fancy logic model. And no, creation takes far more energy. What's its degree of organization? This is a physicist writing. These are questions that are a physics textbook. But those are questions we need to think about as we think about replicating our interventions. And you see, a number of our interventions actually are pretty hard to meet this test. So the other literature that connects with this is the system dynamics literature. Again, won't go through all of these ideas, but pay attention to the last one. Very often we implement interventions in specific contexts and specific communities. And we either don't study it, or we're expecting an applause from everybody to say, well done. But in reality, when you implement something new, the system is going to strike back. This idea of a policy resistance. The result of policy resistance, the tendency for interventions to be defeated by the system's response to the intervention itself. So it's very critical we just don't pay attention to our intervention as though it's a separate island by itself. Paying attention to the ecology where it's embedded becomes super, super critical. This is an important idea, and this is the other idea that sort of had me move towards a transition. I was trained as a statistician, and I just thought on day one, let's bring the best statistical methods to create a design. This is one of the great grandfathers of statistics, right? He says the best time to design an experiment is after it's finished. The converse, the worst time is the beginning, when least is known. He goes on to make important points. I'll stop here. But this is critical, because 95 times out of 100, before this sort of insight, I thought, no, we are going around debating what's the best design, without actually paying attention to the complexities of the system we're intervening. This is industrial engineer type statistician writing. So all of this is a rather long-winded introduction to developmental evaluation. And here's where, and I use a soup metaphor to introduce developmental evaluation. Very often, you're playing the role of a friendly spouse. What do you think of the soup? The answer you give is some version of the soup needs a little more salt, needs a little more pepper. That's a tweaking kind of problem. And how you reply matters. It might impact whether you're going to be invited to the kitchen again. So it's very critical that you pay attention to your role. No one's asked you to be the biggest guru in town when somebody says, how's the soup? In the first scenario. Summative. That's when you're playing the role of a restaurant critic. You go, well, this is terrible, this is fantastic. You'll make a statement, do not go to this restaurant again. Something along those lines. Where you are making a thumbs up or a thumbs down judgment. How you say things doesn't matter as much as when you do it formative. This was the more traditional views of evaluation, where the assumption was you knew what soup you were making. Tomato soup or mulligatawny or whatever. Scottish. So I don't know if I can add a reference to haggis along the way, but I'll try to score some points. Right. So, but the problem is, very often we are cooking, and this is what surprised me over time. We're actually cooking new dishes all the time, where we may have evidence that peppers are a good thing, leeks are fantastic, tomatoes are terrific. What we don't have evidence for is how can we concoct this complex blend of different interventions. So part of developmental then becomes, What role will the evaluator itself play in the making of such a soup? Remember, what we are trained as evaluators do not interfere with the program. And my own journey was, there's a serious problem here. What is my role? Do I just, as the have-a-heart pays? I said, well, actually, don't tell me. My job is to keep the business as usual. I've changed my mind. I think there are times when people would say it makes sense if the soup needs to be made. If you're being useful, help out with the soup. And I'll talk about what help out means actually. But for me, it's not blasphemous at all. If people are addressing a complex problem and increasing at the evaluation center, we actually test with raising those kinds of questions that can help make such a soup. Okay? Of all my slides, and there are too many of them, this is the one slide you need to pay attention to. So, last slide before I move on to developmental. Let's go back to have-a-heart Paisley. Let's go back to Scotland. And part of my learning with the have-a-heart Paisley example was there's a policy landscape. Scotland is at a time in which it wants to do things better than its neighbors down south. They want to really take the lead and address the problems of health inequities. So there's a policy landscape. Based on evidence and some grand theory, folks come up with ideas for programs. This is a demonstration project. The hope is that this is going to get spread all across Scotland. Now here's where it gets interesting, and this is what I was not trained to do. I thought, and I'll make the other link to this obvious, I thought I could just proceed directly to the evaluation. Let's go, apply the methods, see if the programs are working. In actuality, what I've learned along the way is often projects, programs need help to think about pathways by which they can have it. I don't particularly care whether the evaluator does it or who does it, but more and more I'm learning somebody's got to do it. And this is not a kind of a condescending story of the poor community. I worked with folks across the street out here where large investments of $200 million and plus, folks still don't have clarity on how is this going to make a difference. I'm working at the Lee Shing Knowledge Institute, where exactly the same questions I ask of have-a-heart Paisley are equally true of our institute. The question we ask is, how did the X amount of $1 million investment actually make a difference to anybody's life? That's a hard question to answer. It's a really easy question to answer on what are our research outputs, etc., etc. The two are not exactly related. So, part of the learning out here was actually when you implement interventions, you need clarity on how to go about it. And it's not just the evaluator's job to answer all these questions, but it is part of our job to raise those questions. Often, when we implement even evidence-based projects, there are areas of massive uncertainty. We need to uncover that. Then comes the actual evaluation, and the other part of learning for have-a-heart Paisley, that I don't have too much time to go through, and actually from an evaluation, there's a whole different types of learnings that are possible. There's learning on policy impacts. There's learning on process. There's learning on organization, etc., etc. Let me just talk a little bit about policy, for example. One of the bigger learnings that draws me back to Scotland is this argument. Be very careful about targeting poor areas without thinking through how to reach the poorest people in a nuanced way. Right? So, I just want to sort of stress this, that at multiple stages along the way, and if I had more time, I would tell you the Scottish story is interesting, because a year into have-a-heart Paisley, the Labour Party got displaced by the Scottish National Party, who decided to take the learnings from have-a-heart Paisley, decide to implement it towards a national strategy called Keep Well Already. We had to align our evaluation based on that. All right, so I'll come back to this if I have more time, but I'm keen to keep things moving. I want to move towards developmental evaluation. So here's where we are. What I've tried to stress for you is that this thing called the program, this thing called the policy, this thing called the intervention, in actuality, the details matter. Very, very often, even with somewhat simple programs, there's a need for greater clarity, greater explication. Very often, the program itself needs development over time. All right, so this is, and Michael Patton, who's a friend, a lot of the next few slides are directly out of Michael Patton, arguments from his book, Developmental Evaluation. It's reasonably new. So he says, I'll tell him more as the book unfolds, blah, blah, blah. Is the purpose and focus of the evaluation helping develop something? Is something getting developed? Did something get developed? If so, what? How? With what implications? The focus of developmental evaluation is on developing innovations. Now, if I had read this for the first time, I'd say, wait a minute, this is interesting, but this is pretty esoteric. more and more in our work, and even for evaluations that are not framed as a developmental evaluation, what's remarkable is how much of the dialogue really starts moving towards, actually, we need to develop this or develop that. And I'll talk more about it in a few minutes. So part of Michael's argument, Patton's argument is, well, it's useful. This kind of thinking is useful for ongoing development and adapting a project, program, strategy. It's important because very often as evaluators, we don't pay attention to issues of adaptation. We sort of pretend things have high fidelity. That's our mantra. Adaptation has not gotten the attention it deserves. Context has not gotten the attention it deserves. Something that's worked in Toronto, how are you so sure it's going to work in Sudbury? What's the role of context? Our knowledge of context leaves a lot to be desired. Developing a rapid response in the face of a major change. We are in a discussion with a humanitarian aid organization that's talking about how can we use these principles when dealing with floods. Pre-formative development about potentially scalable innovation. So part of what the center did was evaluate Grand Challenges Canada, right across the street. So actually, how sure are you that these grand ideas are actually scalable? And if you say the return on money is going to come through a scaling, tell me, where do you actually, what makes you so sure about it? Major system changes and cross-scale developmental evaluation. We'll talk a little bit about systems in a few minutes. I like this slide. This is an important, the next two slides are important, and this is actually a fundamental difference between the standard approach to evaluation and developmental evaluation. One approach simply says, we did something. Did it work? Did it not work? You keep it simple, cut the long story short, I got to eat lunch, etc., etc. You want the quick elevator speech. So you have a thermostat, it's too hot or too cold, it takes that information and decides to provide some action. That's an example of a single loop learning. Double loop learning is actually when you have a model. As a result of going through this process, you say, actually, my assumptions were problematic. I actually have to rethink what I'm doing. That's an example of double loop learning. So this is actually John Sterman and Michael Patton. John Sterman is a system dynamics person based at MIT. Right. So I like this. That's a Sterman's slide. So you have the real world. I like this slide because it really provides a good basis for a lot of the work we do. So you have the real world. One style of approach is you collect information on how's this program working. So I'm looking at my team here, the drug treatment funding program. Is there evidence that it's actually working? Based on that, you provide feedback, and somebody takes a decision. Should we cut the funding? Should we continue? Etc., etc. It's pretty cut and dry. No one's paid you here to say, get too deep about it. Just tell me, is it working or not? Go home otherwise. There's another type of learning. To actually say, as a result of implementing drug treatment funding programs, are we learning about the underlying mental model of how to bring about changes in the system? Are we learning, are we questioning our assumptions? As a result of this, you question, you sort of think through the strategies, structures, etc. That's an example of double loop learning. A lot of what developmental evaluation tries to do is focus on double loop learning. Question your assumptions, etc. So if you're in a hurry, if you're saying, just tell me, Sanjeev, is it working or not? I would say, focus on the standard approach. And there's nothing I'm telling you today that says this ought to be replacing everything the traditional folks do. I still do that. We run our cities, we do all that stuff too. But we try to do this stuff too, because this stuff matters. Because often policymakers are asking these kinds of questions. In the Scottish example, I think, and this is where it wasn't sort of being platitudinal, I found Scotland having the space, often in America, for example. You get commissioned to do an evaluation, you're supposed to write the report, end of story. In Scotland, you really were not allowed to participate in a project if you were not willing to meet with people every month and discuss these kinds of issues. And it was a fairly fundamental issue. So again, Patton, a few differences. Situation where it's appropriate, the standard formative/summative, a manageable and stable situation. Root cause of the problem being addressed is known and bounded. Intervention reasonably well conceptualized, goals known, the key variables expected to affect outcomes are controllable, measurable, and predictable. Okay, there are many situations like that. There are also many, we live in a world of constant change. A complex, dynamic environment, no known solution to priority problems, no certain way forward, and multiple pathways possible. Need for innovation, exploration, and social experimentation. A quick 1-minute segue. with the International Development Research Center, the Evaluation Center, along with partners in China, the China National Health Development Research Center, we've gotten a large project to work on evaluating health inequities in China. It's a capacity building project. What's remarkable is I thought most of the Chinese would sort of focus on a much more traditional show us accountability. But once we got into developmental evaluation, it was remarkable to see the kinds of excitement folks had. And part of the reason was this recognition that it's an incredibly complex dynamic situation where things are almost changing on a monthly basis. All right, dominant field. Slice dominant niche and mindset. Very often you want to just tell me if a program works. Focus on this is the summative. Focus on effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and scalability. Very often you're actually saying, actually no, I'm not sure how investing in 11 drug treatment projects is going to change the world. So the question becomes, can you explore possibilities? Generating ideas and try them out, preform model, preformative, non-summative in that ongoing innovation and development is expected, never arriving at a fixed intellectual. This is where I part company with Patton. This is Patton writing. Part of my interest in our own work is not so much developmental evaluation as constant development. I think there comes a point where the soup is made, and this is where I differ from Patton. I'm actually saying I'm interested in, can we combine developmental evaluation, perhaps in phase 1, with a phase 2 that says, well, actually, now the soup is made. Let's play the restaurant critic. How good is the soup? And that's when you can ask questions of, is your role compromised by the fact that you were actually making the soup? And my answer is probably not. Because some of the most critical people I've seen are projects, like Paisley. It was not our data that showed there was a problem. It was the program staff who had deep concerns about how the project was being implemented. So my experience as an evaluator for the last 2 decades has been, people closest to the programs are often the most critical. It's cliche that says, well, you are part of the program, you have an invested interest. I have not found as much of it in my own work. All right, targets of change. Often, in the summative, identified outcomes for intended program beneficiaries and participants change in individual behaviors and performance indicators. So these individuals get this treatment, tell me is it working or not. I think this summative seems the way to go. Very often, we're interested in modifying systems. In fact, I would argue in the addiction treatment system, I'm not even sure whether there's anything called a system. That's actually too kind a word. Systems change along a continuum from a small local system to disruptive social innovation aimed at major cross-scale impacts on big problems. So, just to sort of summarize as we sort of move to the couple of examples. First is, very often you have incomplete knowledge. At the Lee Ka-shing Knowledge Institute, if I ask my bosses, are you sure we actually know how to impact the local Toronto community as a result of our work? The answer is not really. Let's try to figure this out. That's a fair answer. It gets silly if you say, let's develop the best metrics already. You've got to know where you're going before you can actually measure whether you've actually made the journey. Understanding context. 3, it's not just a singular context. Often the contexts themselves are changing over time. So understand context dynamically. 4, that's pretty dear to the work we do, is timelines of impact. Far too often, a lot of our interventions are saying, bring about these changes in 3 years. We've not actually paid attention to it. This is a long-term game. Health equities did not, so in the Paisley example, health equities in Scotland did not get bad in 3 years. It's taken centuries, not decades itself too. Chances are a 3-year project is not going to bring about change. So I think we have to be a little bit more modest and a little bit more real about this. 5th is nature of connections. We often throw words like partnerships around very glibly, pretending like we understand what they mean. So I was working in India, the World Health Organization a month ago. The focus was on addressing health equities in India. And folks kept saying, well, WHO is going to partner with the Ministry of Health. That's silly, because what is the nature of this partnership? And why would the Ministry of Health is this large beast? WHO is a small mouse compared to that. Why would they partner, etc., etc.? We're not clear about that. Often, lots of our interventions are alignment, but long-term goals are pretty unclear. How will this happen? You'll see as you start unpacking the logic of most of our programs, somewhere along the way what we're really saying is, and then a miracle happens. That's what we're really saying. I think bringing that clarity becomes important. I won't go through all of this stuff, in the interest of time. So the question I think, so what do you do? As I was thinking on the slide, I was sitting in a coffee shop this morning. I said, no, the first thing you've got to do is hang out. Not the kind of cool, sophisticated answer you want. Far too often, if you're getting into a relationship that says, just send me the data, or I'm an evaluator, bow down, all that kind of stuff, it's not going to work. You've actually got to hang out. Like Paisley example, I had budgeted. It's actually, so this is an important comment because developmental evaluation takes time, takes energy, in ways that you can't predict. So as an example, in the first year in Paisley, I had budgeted 3 trips between Edinburgh to Paisley. It's a 2.5-hour bus ride one way. I thought 3 trips should do it. I ended up making 35 visits. Not because I was the hero figure out, no rubbish of that. It was either you have a seat on the table or you don't. And the goal here is not the evaluators here. It's quite the opposite. Understand, as I'm sort of saying, you really can understand a lot of these situations from a distance. Shauna and me went to a program just last week where we had read enough documents. Our understanding of the program changed dramatically once you actually went to the site. Question. I think a lot of our role, is why hanging out becomes important, is to actually create spaces where these questions are possible. Relationship build. I think part of, sometimes with the more traditional evaluation, is really you are trying to create spaces where dialogues are possible, etc. Often we leave out the relationship building part. Facilitate, create spaces for dialogue, workshops, and connect. So again, this is a different skill set from what we normally associate with evaluation. So 2 examples, in fact, for one of our projects called the Teasdale-Corti evaluation, which I actually presented this in the Department of Foreign Affairs and CIHR last week. So this is the Teasdale-Corti initiative. It's a $25 million initiative, where the focus was to contribute, this is the headline, to contribute to improving health and strengthening health systems in low and middle income countries by supporting innovative international approaches to integrating health generation, etc., through research, health research capacity development, and the use of research evidence for health policy and practice. So the basic idea was the following. This is a slightly uglier version of this coming. CHR, CEDA, now the Department of Foreign Affairs, and IDRC got together and said, let's invest $25 million in the following experiment. Can a researcher in a southern country join up with a knowledge user locally? So it's Colombo, Sri Lanka. Can they form a partnership? And they work with a researcher in a Canadian university, let's say Calgary, giving real examples. Can they work on addressing a local problem in Colombo or Peru, etc., etc.? So, 14 large grants were given, about $2 million each. A whole lot of stuff happened. The promise was that this would somehow impact health equities, etc., etc. Nowhere along the way, they said, well, in 5 years we'd like to see the following outcomes. Can we develop metrics for it? Actually paying attention to some of the issues we actually talked about. Is it realistic to fund groups like this and expect those kinds of changes in 5 years is one such question. So there's a slightly more complex version. I won't go through this. But what I want to stress, the important idea, this is direct control, direct influence, and indirect influence. In actuality, for most of our interventions, our direct control, in this case funding teams, is pretty limited. It's not by providing people money. Doesn't necessarily mean you can actually influence health equity options. You hope you can. Best of luck. But in reality, the indirect influence matters. I won't describe this. The slide actually got a little massacred when I shifted from Mac to here. But the point being, I'm just sort of stressing the idea, if I had more time, I'd unpack this further. But I thought, let the mess speak for itself. So the questions, and again, if I had more time, I'd speak more about it. But the question you need to reflect on, I come back to questions I've already talked about. Turns out CHR and CEDA and IDRC were making some rather remarkable assumptions about how change, and as a taxpayer, I think it's fair to ask them, how valid is this assumption? How complete is our knowledge of how these initiatives are intended to work? And what I find is people use words like it's evidence-based as a very unnuanced way of actually being true about, we're pretty sure about doing these activities, we don't have a clue about this. And we need to create spaces in which it's okay to say we're going to muddle through for this sort of stuff. In my view, that's what innovation means. 2, it's fundamentally different in implementing something in Colombo versus Calgary. I don't think we spend as much time learning about context, etc. When I teaching doctoral classes, I really stress that people have to really write dissertations on context, etc., etc. 3, again, I keep coming back. If we are making long journeys from here to California, for example, and after 2 hours you call me up and say, have you reached California? If I'm driving, it seems silly. In 2 hours at best I might reach Buffalo. So the idea here is performance should be based on the roadmap and some idea of what is the distance of travel. We somehow expect miracles. Folks, far too often what we mean by accountability is a blabbering of all these activities happen. This happened, that happened, that happened. It's not really clear. Tell me how much did you move the goalpost towards the promised outcomes, etc. This is actually important. For Teasdale Corti, the basic theory of change, the basic assumption, and it's actually really critical, was the knowledge user and the researcher will get together and figure out a partnership to crack a local problem. Do you know what actually happened? And this is not a surprise to anybody. Actually, knowledge users, they signed the letters, and this is a game I play all the time. In the 5 years after that, for the most part, there was very, very limited interaction. The researchers did their own thing. When the researchers from Canada and researchers from southern countries worked together, for the most part, the knowledge users were not part of the actual involvement process. So the question, the surprise was, why don't we actually have a metric? If relationship building is critical to this game, why don't we actually have a metric for relationship building? Where people say, actually, no, someone's watching, whether our relationships are growing or etc. Instead, the metrics are, what are your research outputs, etc. So there's a bit of a problem between what we consider to be useful metrics and what are the incentives to bring about change. The second, and there's a large team here that's working on this. This is a drug treatment funding project. We did the phase 1, we're involved in phase 2. This is what the drug treatment, this is a Health Canada project that through the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and through CANACH, a series of 11 projects. Look at the goal. DTFP aims to provide the incentive, it's fairly nebulous, for provinces, territories, and key stakeholders to initiate projects that lay the foundations for systemic change leading to sustainable improvements in the quality and organization of substance use treatment systems, etc., etc. I won't go through it. But once again, it's actually a similar, the basic idea was about $5 million. 11 projects were selected. Each of the projects were supposed to do their thing. Their hope was there would be collaboration and co-development between the 11 projects. There was, so let me go through, some sort of networks were also set up, etc. There was an evaluation that was funded. But here's the important part, and I don't have too much time to go through it. Each of the projects were tasked to bring about innovations in performance measurement and knowledge translation. You can do whatever you want. All that stuff is not going to matter if there's not a serious process of uptake and spread. How are we planning for actually taking this innovation that a group in Northern Toronto has done or in Sudbury has done and spread across the system? And here's the quandary. Accountability is defined purely with have the 11 projects turned in the reports. But in actuality, the whole nature of this experiment, if you're actually serious about goals like efficient and effective services, client-centered services, it's the ministry, the LINs have to be doing something in real time. The analogy I use is when Pepsi Cola goes to Nepal, there'll be one division that'll say, actually, well, let's create a new formula for Nepal, make it more spicier, etc. There's one group that's doing that. There's a second group that's building a distribution system. Let's plan for success. Once this comes through, how are we going to disseminate it? In my experience, people worry about this once this is done. That's too late. So part of accountability is, what are you expecting, etc., etc. And the story gets worse. People forget what they commissioned 2 years ago, etc., etc. So it's a fairly problematic story. So developmental evaluation was useful here for connection where projects can learn from one another, help in documenting project processes, help in learning how to evaluate networks, etc., etc. But part of what we argued, and this is where we were on their face, it's somewhat surprising that they asked us for phase 2, was the fact that at the project levels, we felt most of the projects were saying, well, here's some cool discovery, etc., without going through a serious testing and validation phase. The whole timeline of impact was cut, everyone was rushing. Not really clear what the value added of each of the projects were. Most importantly, once you ask the projects, are you sure? Let's say you come up with a new innovation. how should the system take up your message? So similar to where you said, actually, here's a new Pepsi, go forth and distribute Pepsi. Well, researchers really struggled with what uptake meant, etc., etc. And this is important because eventually this funding was only for 3 years. The original plan was for 5 years. It became 3 years. It became 18 months. Now it's been increased by about a year or so. Ministry. This is actually critical because accountability, the way it's defined, it's too hierarchical. You've got to submit your stuff, that's accountability. Really, if you're not serious about what your roles are about spread, etc., and this is what I thought was part of development, asking questions about, if you are not planning for this, chances are it's not going anywhere. And if you're saying, well, March 31st, we'll decide on April 5th, I've never seen that example. More importantly, the addiction treatment system, the needs are changing. There are new policies, new comprehensive strategies that are coming along. How are you aligning the needs of what the system needs with what's being developed now? Again, story I've heard repeatedly, not really clear. What's the ministry's role? What's the LIN's role? So I won't go through all of this. My point being, for each of us, there was sort of a clear set of ongoing learning. We had a steering committee meeting. What we did actually, we had a website for DTFP. We would go back and say, actually, based on our theory of change, this is our ongoing learning, etc., etc. But I'm going to wrap it up with the last 2 slides. So here's what I mean by accountability learning. The most important idea here is, and this is actually a self-critical comment, conducting an evaluation, or investments in evaluation, is not the same as learning at all. In fact, very often, it's an escape from learning. You say, don't bother me. I've hired the evaluation center, Accenture, whatever it is. So I think the questions we should be asking the ministry, asking LINs, asking whoever's commissioned evaluation. But what's being learned? Really, you invested huge amounts. There's not a free evaluation in the world. It takes time, it takes energy, even if it's pro bono. What's being learned? Which of your key assumptions have been challenged? Have you learned something about your timeline of impact? Have you learned? Not is DTFP working, but what is it about DTFP that's working? Have you learned something about your existing services and gaps? What I've learned through DTFP and almost every other project, we actually don't know about as much of the world as we should know before we intervene. And really, this should be much more of a circular learning. The other part I've also learned is not so much the amount of funding, but the timing of funds matter critically in the evolution of projects and systems. We don't pay attention to natures of timing. Fifth, how are your own ideas around policy shifting as a result of this evaluation? Sixth, what have you learned about context implementation? Remember, most of our knowledge is theoretical. When we implement projects, it's our chance to learn about context implementation. Again, learning context, I meant to say, a lot of our projects require partnerships. What have you learned about partnerships? Who is learning? So it's not enough to say the ministry has learned. Not enough to say LINs have learned. Be specific. Learning has to happen by specific. So the last grand slide is, so what? Where does all this fit into? I'm part of a doctoral program in the University of Toronto, in evaluation. We're trying to develop similar kinds of projects in other places. Where do the ideas sit? We sort of move towards, what does it take to make evaluations matter? Here is my ideas. Number one, it's a theoretical idea. And this is coming from what's called a realist perspective. In actuality, it's not just by doing a program, miracles don't happen. It's programs under certain contexts, given the right kind of support systems, is where miracle happens. So far too often we make the statement, this program is evidence-based. What we actually mean is this program under the following context with these kind of deeper knowledge. So we've got to move away from a successionist view where A leads to B, towards A when endowed with the following conditions, leads towards B. Okay? An evaluation provides a chance to bring that kind of learning. Two, it's an important idea that we're developing in a couple of volumes. It's happening at the center. It's not a singular evidence that's in itself useful. You say, well, there's evidence that DTFP has worked in Ontario. That's actually not enough to say, well, I did a great quasi-experiment. In actuality, to replicate programs, you need an ecology of evidence. So, a wonderful writer, Danny Roderick, who talks about the evidence, the hard evidence from RCTs need to be supplemented with a lot of soft evidence. You've got to pay attention to such an ecology. What's the minimal ecology that's needed? Three is actually important. We have to be far more honest about the incompleteness of our own knowledge as we try to seek about bringing about change. Fourth, and this is the theme of today, how do we integrate knowledge translation with evaluation? Fifth is critical, and this is something I think we gloss over. Far too often, centers like mine, we do research projects. We actually are not part of building capacities of systems. So the China project, a great example, where they said, actually, no, don't work with us without proof that you're actually building our capacities over time. Why is that important? Problems like drug abuse, diabetes, health inequalities are not going to be solved over 3 years and 5 years. The whole idea of doing research, in my view, is also to build capacities. Sixth is quite critical. I just talked about the time horizons. The functional forms actually has a deep meaning. But a point I made about timelines of impact. Far too often, most of our interventions are planned without thinking through concretely for how long will things take. I think evaluations provide you a chance to learn about that. Seventh, this is the theme of today. I think we've got to be developing capacities for developmental evaluation. More about this. I think the eighth point is important. Too much of our evaluation debates are about best methods. So actually, I don't have too much time. And people say, well, I prefer RCTs for developmental. I say, go for it. That's not a problem. Because in actuality, you need different types. You need a portfolio. You need a meal of different approaches to actually bring about change. And finally, I think the bigger problem, and this is where I think the evaluation field has not done a good job, is if you do an evaluation in 3 sites and 5 sites, so Have a Heart Paisley worked fantastically. What does it actually mean for the Scottish government? Does it mean you've got to implement Have a Heart Paisley all across Scotland? What are the processes of spread, scaling, and generalization? For the most part, the field has not engaged with that question. I'll stop here. Questions?